Welcome to our podcast, where I, Keely Severson, Eric Johnson, and Alicia Swami are exposing mold. Today we are here with Dr. David Lewis. Dr. David Lewis at one point was awarded the highest EPA award for the Science Achievement Award. After Dr. David Lewis was raising questions about EPA policies on land application of treated sewage sludge, it actually cost him his job. Dr. David Lewis, would you please share your story and what happened?
Sure. Keely, I appreciate that introduction. At the US EPA's research laboratory, one of 12 independent research labs that belong to the EPA throughout the United States, I focused on what I consider to be the most important environmental problem we have. My fundamental research that I published in Nature and other leading science journals was climate change. My laboratory director asked me if I would take on that issue when it first came out in the 1980s. And so I pursued that, and in the course of pursuing that, I ended up visiting land application of sewage sludge sites all across the United States and even in Canada, and documenting the adverse health effects that are associated with taking sewage sludge, which is all of the effluent that goes through the sewer lines and ends up at some sewage treatment plant in every municipality in the United States and in every country abroad. All of that hazardous waste, both biologically hazardous, chemically hazardous from standpoint of heavy metals, any way you look at it, it is the most concentrated form of potentially every pollutant we know of and don't know of. So to take that material and begin to spread it on our farms and school playgrounds, public parks, places where sports events are handled, football and whatever. Basically, every piece of land we can find and dump this stuff on in high concentrations, that just suddenly came into vogue when I was doing my research. And fortunately, at the grade level I was at, GS 15 in the federal grade level schedule, at that level, I had the privilege of choosing whatever research I wanted to do. And no one within the federal government could say, no, you can't look at that, or you've got to do something else. So I had a great opportunity to just really dive into what I thought was the worst possible environmental problem, more so than even climate change with all the attention it's getting. And I had just last month, relevant to this podcast right now, I had a film producer in Los Angeles call me up and had an email exchange with me back and forth for a while, and she told me her story about moving into a new house in LA. And Los Angeles was an area that I did a lot of my research on adverse health effects being reported by local residents from exposure to land-applied sewage sludge. And that's treated sewage sludge after it's been through all the processes that'll ever be used to treat it and put on farms and school playgrounds and whatever. But her story was that she moved into this house that she had bought, and immediately started experiencing all kinds of health problems. And the health problems she described to me reminded me of sick building syndrome, as they call it, which I have investigated a number of cases of that. It hasn't been the center of my focus. It just struck me that what she's describing is sick building syndrome, which has become controversial, where different factions are pulled back and forth whether it really exists, and if it does, what's the cause or causes. And it reminded me, beyond that, of interviews that I had with the New York Times, where the New York Times reporter came down and visited me at a land application of sewage sludge site, not far from where I live, about an hour's drive. And we spent the day out there talking to local farmers, local residents who were getting sick from land application of sewage sludge, which is used to fertilize farms. And as the reporter and I sat on a stack of baled hay, and the hay had been treated sewage sludge and baled up, and we were sitting on it, and it hit both of us at the same time. We started getting severe migraine headaches. I started having difficulty breathing. She started having difficulty breathing. So in real time, as we sat there and talked about my research in this area, she experienced exactly what I was documenting in the scientific literature. The problem with that, so far as my career in science is and was, is that my top boss in Washington, D.C., whose name was Henry Longus II, he developed EPA's policies on land application of sewage sludge way back in the 80s and began to promote them. And he was being manipulated, for lack of a better word, by the sewage sludge industry, the waste disposal industry, and government at every level. I'd never really thought about it before. The executive director of the National Whistleblowers Center in Washington, D.C. explained it to me one day when we were having lunch. He said, you know, when it comes to bucking the government or not falling in line with the government's line on any given issue in science or politics or the mixture thereof, he said, there's not one in the world that you could pick that would bring more resources together from government industry to stop what you're doing than that one issue. And he said, just think about it. In every municipality in the United States and beyond, and other countries around the world, you have local governments with a local mayor, in our case in the United States, who oversees some little town, municipality somewhere, or some huge municipality in New York City, for example. They all depend, their economies to a significant extent, on being able to take sewage sludge, which has every pollutant known and unknown, and just spreading it on land somewhere, getting rid of it, not spending any more money than you have to process it in a way that it's no longer toxic, no longer infectious. And one thing that I learned early on in my research in a totally unrelated area, but the mechanics of government control of science has certain characteristics that are universal, and this is one of them. The first issue that I took on entailed publishing research in Lancet and Nature Medicine, where I demonstrated that dental drills are used for putting fillings in our teeth. Those dental drills in operation suck up bits of mercury amalgam that are being drilled out of your teeth if they have fillings in them. They're picking up your saliva and they're picking up blood. All of that material I discovered in the laboratory, where I reproduced that and worked with local dentists to do my research, was that these dental drills were sucking blood and saliva back into them in visible amounts. And so all I did to demonstrate that, in conjunction with my research, in which I and my co-authors demonstrated in the laboratory that dental drills that are reprocessed with glutaraldehyde, a disinfectant at the time, that was widely used and recommended by the FDA and others, and the EPA, where I work, that you can follow those government guidelines for disinfection, but that dental drill is mixing these bloody saliva with lubricants that are used to lubricate the dental equipment, and that lubricant's water repellent. So you can put all the water-soluble disinfectants on it you want. It's never going to disinfect it because they're not mixable. You can't mix gasoline and water, which is basically what the dental establishment was doing. So I actually am working with others at the University of California, was able to demonstrate that this material that's being spit back out by dental drills and dental patients around the world is highly infectious with HIV. But it's low enough a level that it's only going to cause sporadic cases. You might get one dental patient infected today in a dental practice. It may be weeks, months before the next patient gets just the right dosage of that material in their procedure. If it's a very bloody procedure, like an extraction or some dental procedure that you can see visible amounts of blood in the patient's mouth, that you're going to get sporadic cases, one here, one there, but then you multiply that times millions or even tens of millions of people around the world who are getting dental procedures in and out. It adds up. It becomes an important mechanism for transmitting HIV. To sort of fast forward that to today and COVID-19 and translating my previous work to our current problem, what I found out discovered with land application of sewage sludge is that vaccines, and the one that I focused on at the time involved taking a vaccination with a live virus, an attenuated live virus. And I was focused on rubella and doing research on autism. That's what my laboratory director was interested in me doing, and I decided to pursue the whole autism mystery. How did we suddenly see autism showing up everywhere? There were only a rare case here and there for decades, and then suddenly in 1988 and 89, suddenly, according to CDC data, autism is just breaking out everywhere. So my focus of my research at that moment in time shifted to looking at rubella, the MMR vaccine, and one of those R's, and the R that is, stands for rubella, the rubella vaccine component of that. What I found is that rubella, as was known and demonstrated by other scientists, when it's ingested and through the digestive tract or is injected, that rubella, which is in the attenuated form, it's been biologically or biochemically, I guess technically to be accurate, is bioengineered to elicit an immune response if it's in a vaccine, but not to transmit that infection. The virus is disabled. And that's done, I mean, the CDC has a handful of vaccines, and COVID is about to be one of those in which attenuated viruses are used in the vaccine. The problem with that is that once that attenuated virus goes through, it's injected into the body or is taken orally, and it ends up eventually in the digestive tract one way or another. Once it gets in the digestive tract, it reverts back to the virulent form. So what that means is that wherever vaccine waste are disposed of, and they all end up one way or another at the wastewater treatment plant, that sewage treatment plant's doing the same thing that the human colon does. It's mixing these attenuated viruses with human feces. And so the same kind of biology, microbiology, and chemistry goes on at the sewage treatment plant that's going on in the human digestive tract. So what that means is that these attenuated viruses, which according to the research I did at EPA, survive waste treatment, and they end up being spread on our school playgrounds, our parks, our golf courses, every piece of land that you can find that needs some nitrogen and phosphorus. EPA would recommend spreading it there, and so did the USDA. So what I did is demonstrate and publish in the peer-reviewed scientific literature that these attenuated viruses are generating and perpetuating outbreaks of vaccine-derived viruses. And what I have sort of sounded the alarm about most recently is that there is now a live COVID virus, vaccine, a vaccine made from the attenuated live COVID virus that is headed toward the market. And at this point, it's being designed to use as a nasal spray rather than injection. But regardless of whether it's injection or nasal spray, that live attenuated COVID vaccine, once it goes through the human metabolism, ends up in the colon, ends up in what's flushed down the toilet, ends up in the sewage treatment plant, and what's in the sewage treatment plant gets spread on farms and school playgrounds and public parks and every other piece of land we can find as free fertilizer. Here we go again. We're going to perpetuate COVID the same way that polio virus has been perpetuated. It drives me crazy to watch the news today. I can't stand it. To watch currently Joe Biden, before him, Barack Obama, you name it, all the way back through decades of presidents, dating way back to the 1940s. This has been the federal government's approach. Let's make attenuated viruses for vaccines, for rubella, for measles, you name it, with a total disregard of where this all leads to. So the irony is today in real time, if you turn on any channel, regardless of where, whether it's MSNBC or Fox News or whatever, you're going to get this same story that vaccines, as President Trump demonstrated, are a good idea. And they are a great idea. But you've got to use killed viruses. And you've got to educate the public. Joe Biden most recently, in the last few days, made what seemed like a perfectly logical statement to the nation, to the world at this point we're at right now. He made this statement. He said, why is it, he asked this question, why is it that I don't hear anything about polio anymore? And it blew me away because here Joe Biden is, President Biden, dealing with a war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of a handful of nations, about half a dozen, in parts of Africa, in Pakistan, and elsewhere, where polio is still a problem. People are ignorant of that. The President of the United States, who's developing our policies on vaccines, is ignorant of the fact that as he carries out a war in Afghanistan, he's dealing with a population of Muslims that is up in arms over the United States using live polio vaccine in Afghanistan. Why does the President of the United States not know that? Why is he not dealing with that? There's a simple solution. You stop using live polio vaccine. If polio has been eradicated in the United States and Canada going back to as early as the 1940s, we were dealing with this, with a killed vaccine. If it's successful enough to eliminate polio throughout the world, except in Pakistan and Afghanistan, a handful of these radical Muslim nations, why are we giving them the live vaccine and not at least warning them, you know, since we're giving you the live COVID vaccine or live polio vaccine or some other live vaccine, make sure you treat it at the waste treatment plants with intense heat. You've got to incinerate it, or you're going to be spreading polio and mumps and measles. So it comes down to the madness of the combination of government and scientific research that Dwight Eisenhower warned about when he left the White House. And he warned famously that our universities have become connected with political interest and industry interest to the point that is undermining our science. Here we are today where vaccine research is going down that same approach, where we're ignoring the fundamentals of science, and scientists like me that come along. In my case, it just so happened that the land application of sewage sludge and transmission of viruses through vaccines was my area of expertise and research. So I understand why the world doesn't get this, but there's no excuse for it. When Joe Biden was running for president, I did what any American has to do to get a politician's ear, and I donated a large sum of money to President Biden's campaign. Trump had failed us on this issue. In fact, President Trump took an active role in suppressing my research, in ending my research. So I went with Joe Biden, contributed his campaign, became actively involved, was invited to be at a luncheon with him. And I thought, well, here's my chance. I'll get to give him a short version of what he needs to do in Afghanistan and Pakistan and a few other areas of the world when it comes to vaccines. And when it comes to land application of sewage sludge, two huge problems. And it never happened. I hate to even say this because it's almost comical the way it ended. After donating all that money and having, which I cannot afford personally, having been terminated from my federal employment for criticizing government policies, here I was risking everything again, and I get an email from Joe Biden's people that the luncheon I was scheduled to have with him has been canceled. And the email I received actually said the reason was I did not donate enough money to his campaign to be part of that luncheon. And I'm speechless, but it's something we all know is going on. And it's got to stop. It's got to stop because it's bringing down science in every form. This area of research is tightly connected with climate change and everything else we're trying to fight. So that, in a nutshell, is my story. So I'm open to answer any and all questions anyone might have.
Dr. Lewis, your sound and video it's just not correlating, and we're getting a lot of extra noises. Is it okay if we just cut the video and just do sound? Would that be okay?
It would be great with me. Let me holler at my wife who handles all that for me.
Sure, thank
I
you.
do
Yeah.
microbiology.
Dr.
She
Lewis,
handles anything.
yeah, what you're saying is so important, and I want the sound to be so crisp because, I mean, I'm terrified, but I'm I'm also, well, anyways, I guess I could tell you how I feel. I am terrified by what he just shared.
I appreciate it
Oh, you're
and
still on. Okay.
very much. And I too am terrified. There is no other word to describe it.
Yeah, I
What
mean,
lies ahead for the
yeah,
United States if we don't fix it?
absolutely. And I think that we're all so focused on getting the injection and what that does to our bodies in the future, but we don't even think about excreting this stuff. And once that is excreted, where does that go and how does that affect our environment? And so thank you for providing that downstream picture, very grim picture, sadly. And you know what, Dr. Lewis, I'm very curious. Are you even living in the United States now that you know what you know?
Uh, I am. I'm living in paradise in Georgia, not far from the University of Georgia, where I used to be on the graduate faculty, and until I criticized EPA policies. And my wife and I uh, worked together to get the word out through these means, through podcasts, through films. I just recently had a film crew from Switzerland and Germany come over and film a movie that will be aired hopefully by November or so on all of my research and how this translates to the things that we just talked about. And another film crew or filmmaker from California just a couple of months ago came over and put together a similar film. So sometimes things work for the best, you know. The worst thing that government and industry can do so far as their own interest are concerned is to suppress research, to make a martyr out of somebody like me, you know. They're asking for trouble. They'd get by with a whole lot more if they would just work with scientists who disagree with other scientists that form the basis of our policies that we live under, and work those things out. Silencing whistleblowers or just ordinary scientists like me who just do our research and publish whatever results we get. That's what our democracy is built on. We've got to protect it. And the best way to solve the concerns, the public concerns about vaccines, is work on the issues, not demonize the public for raising concerns, not talk about them as if they're scientifically ignorant, which I am not, as one example. We've got genuine problems, but fortunately, we can fix these. Let's just deal with it rather than deny it.
Are we so far gone though at this point where, you know, that these institutions, the EPA, CDC, you know, obviously you don't have experience with them, but I feel like we're so far gone beyond the point of rationalizing with these organizations, just based on our own experience, Eric's experience. How do we turn this around? How do we bring the rationalism back to science to fix what we've done?
In my opinion, we need to do the same thing that was done with polio when I believe it was FDR at the time, that we were coping with polio back in the 1940s and on into the early 50s or so. And what the President of the United States at the time did is took the scientists, one or two scientists like Salk, and worked with them one-on-one. They knew what the problem was. They knew how to fix the problem. You've got to connect the scientists, at least one or two of them, directly with the White House, directly with the President of the United States, to where the President of the United States is standing there to take down every single barrier in politics, in academia, in federal agencies that stands in the way. That's the only way we can solve this problem, and we are, in my opinion, up against a wall bigger than we have ever been in the history of the United States. We have seen this develop over the last few years in ways that have never occurred before. In my current book that I'm working on, I'm detailing what happened in my own case, my own little singular case of having gotten involved with the Biden campaign and working with other scientists throughout the world on not only the vaccine issue, but climate change and other things, and getting a lot of press on that. What has happened as these issues are raised, first by a handful of scientists and then by different members of the public who take up a concern in it, is it generates this backlash at the White House to where what the President of the United States is doing is reaching out to the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy. If you take what has gone on with the vaccines, rather than solving the problem where the vaccines are ending up in sewage sludge and that's getting spread all around us, and you get a transfer of the live virus, vaccine viruses, rather than solving that simple little problem, they've gotten into the mode, which is their constant fallback, is to back up their agencies. Let's back up the CDC and put some muscle behind CDC policies. Let's enforce them. You lose your job if you don't do what the CDC says, or if you don't do what the FDA says. That's being done to our leading scientists. We're silenced. You got to do what these bureaucrats say. And we're sitting back saying the bureaucrats don't know what they're talking about. It's so frustrating, it's mind-boggling, but until Biden or his successor grasp that and do something about it, we are not going to last as a democracy. We are months away to a few years away from losing our democracy if things keep going in the path we're going.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. And, you know, as much as we're seeing these scientists these days being bought by industry, we're also seeing the media being bought by industry. And you're seeing a one-sided narrative. And anything else that comes into question is, you know, is completely shut down or fact checked, you know, as being false. It's quite preposterous what we're seeing right now. I almost feel like I'm living in a twilight zone. Like I can't put my mind and my rational mind to understand everything that we're dealing with these days. And, you know, I just really appreciate you continuing to fight for what's right, and to fight for the science, because we are losing that. You know, we are losing good science.
Well, thank you, Alicia, and I just hope that it still can be, in fact, turned around. If I had a couple of last things to say, it would be go back and just read the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. Back in the days, only a few decades ago, several decades ago, when hordes of scientists at the CDC in Atlanta bailed ship. They quit because of just what we're discussing now. It's become futile. The same thing happened at the US EPA, which wasn't even covered by the national media. The national media, despite my best interest to get the word out to the New York Times, the Washington Post, which I did. I had their personal emails. They had covered my research in the past, but they've reached a point they're not dealing with this anymore. They're blindsided by what's going on, and we're in a different situation the United States has never been in before and will not survive if we don't turn this around. I lost my job, but that's nothing compared to what I saw in my office at EPA, and I was working hand in hand with the CDC in Atlanta on the vaccine issue and other issues, and watched as scientists at the CDC and the EPA just had all they could take of this. They weren't going to spend their lives anymore sitting in a seat getting paid a very good salary, publishing scientific articles here and there, but not allowed to address the real problems. And so we've lost the infrastructure to the CDC and the EPA, and it will take a decade or two to turn that around, of finding new scientists to put in their places, put in the places of these government employees that have been brought in who will do whatever politically that their top boss in Washington wants them to do. We don't have a mechanism to clean out federal agencies. You know, they're in it for life till they get, as long as they can still breathe while they're sitting in their chair at their government office, they've got a job.
Dr. Lewis, I know we're coming up on the hour mark, but this conversation and your time with us is so valuable. I would love to extend it. If you have, you know, maybe an extra 30 minutes to tack on to this interview, would that be okay?
Uh, I am happy with sitting here until our power goes out, if that ever happens.
Fantastic. I love that
Uh,
answer because I'm telling you, we have a list of things that we would love to cover with you because this, honestly, this is the greatest conversation we probably had on this show. And like the information needs to go out there and I would love to just kind of cover this from different angles.
I would love to as well, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity. I don't think I've ever had this opportunity before, an
Fantastic. Yeah.
open door.
Yeah, I mean, this is what exposing mold is built upon. We're built upon the truth, trying to get to the root of issues, sticking to good science. This is not something that you see these days in the media. We're a free media source. We're not bought. Uh, you know, we don't have incentives to push us a singular narrative. And again, we like to get to the truth and to what's extremely important, and what's going to affect everyone. And from what you're saying, I don't think people understand biosolids and sewage. And what I'm curious is, do we even have the technology? Like, has the EPA even invested the money into finding technology that would break this down for it to become less harmful?
Yeah, that's one of the saddest things about this whole story is that problem can be fixed. We can't undo what's already been done. I mean, it's hard for me to even sit here and think about the fact that if we had turned our scientists at EPA and the CDC loose and let them be free to solve this problem when it began, it could have been solved then. We've had decades pass now where farms and forests and school playgrounds and golf courses, every piece of land that you can see with the eye, potentially from coast to coast in the United States and in countries abroad, but just focusing on the United States, America has been covered now with concentrated forms of every pollutant known and unknown, every heavy metal, radioactive elements, every infectious disease, many of which, even though they're fragile viruses, can survive in the environment if they're mixed with fats, animal fats, for example, which is what 30% of sewage sludge is. We actually have created a system in every municipality in the United States to put all of our pollutants, every heavy metal, every toxic chemical known and unknown, in high concentrations, mix it with animal fats that will preserve it, will even keep the viruses alive, and then spread that all around us where we grow our food, where our children play, where people go to hospitals to recover from the very illnesses that we're creating with land application of sewage sludge. The irony of what we're doing, it almost exceeds the stupidity of what we're doing. We've got to fix this. And I try every way I can think of to help people to visualize what's being done. One of the more successful visualizations that I've come up with in the last, over the last year, that I've gotten a lot of good feedback on, is to take a photograph that NASA took from the space shuttle as it passed over North Africa, the Sahara Desert, an area that I've done research in. And it really struck a chord with me because what NASA showed on a global scale, looking at our hemisphere from outer space, you could see on the right side of the photograph or the video, whichever you're watching from NASA, you could see the northwestern coast of Africa where the Sahara is, and you could see all the way across the Atlantic to the horizon on the other side of the planet where North America and South America can be visualized. And what you see in one view is these reddish brown dusts in the Sahara Desert being whipped up into the air. And like I said, I've done research in Egypt on several occasions, and I've walked those sands and with my face covered with cloth trying to breathe. And I've seen that and experienced it. But to see it on a global scale and see that that soil is moving through the air currents at the edge of space and coming down on North America and settling out all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Here in Georgia and in Florida, we actually experienced that a year or two ago where local news media were photographing these dust from the Sahara coming in and settling all around us. Every year, the CDC treats numerous cases in the eastern United States of viruses that are coming with the Sahara dust and settling down in our area that we breathe, that come and settle in our house, on our food we're eating. It's insane. And you look in the other direction at California, and you see the same thing from outer space there. The winds coming across China are crossing the Pacific and settling down in California and inland from there. And the CDC and local hospitals in those areas are dealing with all these infections, but no one's addressing the problem. We've got to quit putting our infectious diseases, leftover vaccines, and toxic organic chemicals and heavy metals in areas like the Sahara Desert and China, where you're just going to get the winds covering the earth with it.
I'm so
And that's why I say this is more important than climate change. Climate change is a huge problem. It was my area of research. I know about it. But this is bigger. It's more imminent. It's more imminent. And it is more unfixable. Climate change comes and goes every 20,000 years. We'll survive it. Some people will. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to moderate it and deal with it. But this is a problem we can fix now that's even bigger. And no federal agency is doing a thing about it. And they're firing scientists who raise these questions. Like me, I'm not the only one. There are droves of other scientists, like I said, CDC and EPA, that just left voluntarily and said they're not coming to work to sit there with their hands tied and watch what's going on.
This is very, very interesting that you bring this up, because we have been monitoring these Saharan dust storms. And we understand that we got hit last year with Godzilla, like the most it's ever been. And then this year we've been getting hit twice. I'm currently monitoring the dust storms. There's a monitoring site where you can look at it. And apparently we're getting hit by one now. Florida is getting it heavily. And the media makes it sound like, oh, these dust storms, they come and fertilize everything and the view is beautiful. And they never talk about the implications of it. And so what it sounds like to me is what you're saying is that these dust storms that come through, they're pulling all the pollutants that have been settled in them, but also what's sitting in the atmosphere, and it's bringing all of that together and then settling down on land and on people, and people are getting sick because of what is in these dusts. But also, and this is a question, are these particulates or heavy metals and everything that's in these dust particulates, are they feeding the microbes that are already currently settled to make toxic algae blooms, to make mold more virulent or anything like that?
Yeah, there is a chemical aspect to the dust particles, and there's a biological one. The biological, by far, in my opinion, is a much greater nightmare. The particulates, I'll go back to a experience I had in the 11th grade in high school, when I went into the little library at Central High School in Thomasville, Georgia, and saw an issue of Science, I believe it was. It was some popular science magazine with peer-reviewed scientific articles in it, and picked it up. And there was a curious little blurb at the beginning about the fact that scientists in the North African area had noticed that there were areas where no plant would grow, not even weeds. So they suspected that the sand had become contaminated with lead or mercury, something like that. It was really toxic and persistent. And so they went about to test it for heavy metals, and lo and behold, what they found was that it didn't have a dangerous level of any heavy metal in it. But what it did have, which scientists had never seen before, was it had part per million level, low part per million levels of every heavy metal in it. Normally you find, uranium here or there, and some other rare earth here or there, but this area had it all. And so when I was at EPA, I went to the laboratory, never having forgot that, and set up an experiment where I reproduced that phenomenon and found that you could take levels of lead and mercury and arsenic and a host of other heavy metals at low part per million concentrations alone, and it would not impact biodegradation. And I'm kind of proud of the way I set up the experiment. I thought it was smart. And when I eventually think of something that's actually smart, I get excited about it. But what I did was in my years of research at EPA, I discovered that there was this one biochemical reaction, a biodegradation reaction, to be precise, that every fungus, every bacterium that I could ever find in the environment would bring about would cause this ester, this form of 2,4-D, which is a common herbicide. It's commonly spread with an organic molecule attached to it. And I found that that organic model attached to it is removed by every bacterium I could find in the world, whether I got it from the Okefenokee swamp or from some desert. It's like a universal indicator of biodegradation rates. And that's a very valuable tool, and I published it.
Dr. Lewis, to cut you off.
One of the reasons I got the Science Achievement Award.
Dr. Lewis, I'm sorry to cut you off, but the sound cut out when you said that last statement. Could you just repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, what I was saying is that the reaction I discovered in studying biodegradation of pesticides was a universal reaction that any bacteria or fungi I could find in any kind of environment would conduct that biodegradation reaction. So I started using that as a tool, and to me, my most important experiment I did with that tool was to look at that biodegradation pathway under all kinds of conditions, all types of environments, soil, water, air, particles, involving every chemical I could throw at it. And what I found was I confirmed this to my satisfaction and published it in the peer-reviewed scientific literature where it was accepted by the scientific community that this reaction, if it doesn't work, if bacteria cannot carry out this biodegradation pathway, then nothing can. It's universal. And so I went back to that article I read in high school and recreated what they observed in the Sahara Desert. I mixed together very low concentrations of every heavy metal, lead, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, in concentrations low enough that it didn't normally cause adverse health effects, wouldn't be expected to. And what I discovered in that process confirmed what was being seen in the Sahara Desert, where not even a blade of grass, of crabgrass, would grow in certain areas. It turns out if you mix an encyclopedia full of chemicals together, and that's what we do at every sewage treatment plant around the world, there is a point at which you mix so many different kinds of toxic heavy metals, toxic organic chemicals together that no form of life on Earth can deal with it. It's a concept that to me, boggles the mind. The thought that what we are doing most intensively with our wastewater treatment plants around the world, but in pollution as a whole. Just a second, let me get my wife to the Sahara Desert, not Australia. What does that mean?
Take your time. Eric, if you want to ask him about cloud seeding and make your comments, feel free when he gets back on. You brought up some good stuff.
That when we quote some of Dr. Lewis's statements later for graphics, we can have some of what you're adding as like the introduction of like the context of the statement.
Yeah, my wife just reminded me that my original interest in this topic we're discussing, which is what happens when you mix very low concentrations of every heavy metal or every toxic chemical together. What does that do to life on Earth? And I actually first got interested in that in some research that was done in Australia, and I followed it up when I was doing some field research in Egypt and traveling out into the Sahara Desert more recently. To get to the point, it boggles the mind, at least it seems to me, if you just think about this. If this is true, and experimentally I've demonstrated it to the satisfaction of the peer-reviewed scientific literature and multiple articles, multiple research experiments and studies, that there is a point that you can reach where you have mixed so many toxic elements and toxic chemicals together, even at very low concentrations, at which life on Earth cannot tolerate it, cannot survive it, can't be sustained. I can't think of a more scary concept as a scientist, particularly of a microbiologist who does field work around the world, who has done, till EPA took that off my shoulders for me by terminating me for not agreeing with some of their policies. It is an everlasting nightmare when you think about it, because that is what we all do. Is what every city, every factory, every municipality out around the world, we've been doing this now since the Industrial Revolution. We are, I'm sure, already reaching this point industrially, to where if we devoted the resources, which is what I was doing, devoting my resources as an EPA scientist to jump on this and see, for example, when you look at the NASA photo and you see dust clouds from the Sahara going across the Atlantic, settling on North America, curving down to Central and South America. Here we're putting all these resources into trying to save Amazonia for good reasons. The Amazonian forests are being removed. That whole ecosystem upon which planet Earth, 20% of its human population depends on the oxygen generated, or excuse me, I didn't word that quite right. Our population depends on Amazonia because Amazonia provides 20% of Earth's oxygen in the atmosphere. So it raises a question to me, if you can see from NASA's photos that the dust on the Sahara traveling across the Atlantic, going down through Central and South America and settling out there, if you can see that with the naked eye, then obviously we are creating ecological and human health problems that we're not even tracking. Nobody's looking at them. And yet you can see it with your own eyes. And the reason it's so important, and as a research scientist at EPA, I studied land, water, and air. I did research in all areas. And what scares me the most are soil particles. Particles of any kind, but particularly soil particles, given the fact that we're putting every infectious agent and every toxic organic chemical and every heavy metal, we're putting it into soil particles to encircle the globe and settle out on our farms and forests and where we live and we work and we play. We have created a doomsday scenario, and all you have to do is look at it from the standpoint of a human being eating a meal, and let's say that person is eating a hamburger sandwich, and it turns out that the hamburger meat came from a cow that was raised on a field, treated with sewage sludge, biosolids. Well, that cow has in its body, throughout its digestive tract, in its lungs, in its circulatory system, even in its brain, because these particles cross the blood-brain barrier. In its tissue, it's got those particles. The way EPA regulates carcinogens, for example, is based on whole body exposure. It assumes that whatever parts per million you're exposed to, that's evenly distributed out throughout your whole body. So that's what our healthcare system and environmental protection system rest upon, that idea. But that idea does not exist in nature when, in fact, we have taken all of these toxic chemicals, sent them to a sewage treatment plant, incorporated them with sewage sludge, treated it with lime or something to sort of disinfect it, and then spread it on the land so that it generates innumerable tiny microscopic particles that we all inhale, we all eat in our food, all of us, the whole world population is being exposed now by a mechanism EPA is not even regulating. It chose not to regulate. you can put as much into the sewage treatment plant of toxic organic chemicals that you want to. But think about it at the microscopic level, like I was saying. So you're out with your friends on a golf course playing golf, having a good time, and that golf course has been treated with sewage sludge. Maybe last month, maybe a year ago, maybe 10 years ago. But all the heavy metals are still there. All the toxic chemicals are still there. If they're all mixed together to where they can't be biodegraded anymore, it's all still there. But say you get just one microscopic particle that it would take a scientist with an electron microscope to even see that particle. But you inhale it, it goes into your lungs, and it comes to rest somewhere in your lungs. Since it's microscopic, it's going to really stick to something. When it comes in contact with some human cell in the lungs, it's going to stick there. And it's going to stick there along with 1 trillion other particles that you're inhaling. If you're anywhere in the pathway of dust blowing off from the Sahara or your local wastewater treatment plant, wherever it's dumping it on some farm and turning it into dust. So we've got a US EPA and a CDC and an FDA and every other federal agency looking at our human exposures to pollutant on a whole body basis and saying, well, we've done all this research and it shows it takes this concentration of such and such a chemical to cause any frequency of cancer we really worry about. But as we learn with cigarettes, particulates are a different matter. Even secondhand cigarette smoke causes significant levels of cancer. The reason is you inhale those little particles, it goes in, it sticks to a lung cell. That lung cell doesn't know what the concentrations of that carcinogen is in any other lung cell in your body. But that's enough for that one lung cell to become cancerous. There's more than enough of every cancerous agent known and unknown on that particle if it came from sewage sludge at some big sewage sludge treatment plant and got spread on the land and you inhaled it. And that's all it takes, one cell in your lungs to begin to metastasize. In reality, it's hundreds of thousands or millions of cells in your lungs that you've inhaled these particles from some land application site or some world on the other side of the planet where these wastes are being spread about on soil and been taken in the currents and coming down for us to breathe. We've lost the battle now. It all happened when EPA approved land application of sewage sludge. People like me, their top scientists were fired if we offered any resistance. And here we are today. What do we do about this? How do you even get Joe Biden's attention when he's corresponding to people like me, begging for more money, more? To this day, I still get emails from him asking me for more money. And as each election rolls around, it just hypes up again. Is that all our president can do for us? Does he not have time to sit down and listen to what I say for 10 minutes, like he promised he would do. At least his staff in Atlanta promised he would do and scheduled it, till he finally just said, that I didn't donate enough money. We're sunk if that's where we are and can't get out of it right now.
So I've got a couple questions about this microbial organic process, this degradation. Is this related to Fenton reaction?
Is it too late for what did you say?
No, I was asking if the process of degradation that you're talking about.
Oh, degradation.
Yeah, that's common to all life forms, all microbes. Is this Fenton chemistry, Fenton reaction?
There's one word I'm having trouble hearing. Is it something reaction?
Yeah, Fenton. When iron oxide is spread on algae, you can create an algal bloom using Fenton reaction.
It's Fenton, Fenton reaction, Dr. Lewis.
Well, I hate to admit it, but I have a PhD in microbiology. I have no idea what that word means.
Okay.
Explain it to me, because I'd like to know.
Well, one of the ways that solvents like trichloroethylene can be broken down is application of iron oxide, iron particles, and the chemical reaction will turn the trichloroethylene to water.
Well, yeah, in the larger picture with biodegradation reactions, you end up with about as many overall metabolites that are more carcinogenic, more toxic, more neurotoxic than you started with. And that's complicated by the fact that with sewage sludge, you have potentially every chemical known and unknown in it, which just drives you to one solution, which is this material has got to be treated. It's got to be treated by gasification, where you take this mixture of the sewage treatment plant that is getting a little lime mixed with it and put on farms, and you raise it to high enough temperatures that it reduces everything to basically the building blocks of life: ammonia, phosphate, carbonates, and that's how we have to eliminate this problem at its source. And if we had done that, 20 years ago, there's no telling what human health, just how much better human health indicators would look right now. I mean, this is something that will change human health globally in short time. Of course, we're rapidly going to approach the point at which we have contaminated the earth so much with this in particulate forms that we're not going to be able to turn this around without a major sapping up of our resources, dealing with it, and people dying and human population declining.
As part of your research, did you look into the impacts of silver iodide cloud seeding?
A little bit. And I had some discussions on that topic with 2 or 3 scientists who were particularly interested in it. And it's something that I believe is a very important component of what we've got to address. If you walk outside and look up in the sky on a clear blue day and clear blue sky, and you see these jets streaking across at 50,000 feet or so, and these trails coming out that seed the clouds and have been shown to impact weather. That is that mechanism, I'm convinced, is an important component of the big picture that we've got to do the basic lab work to understand the microbiology and the chemistry and integrate that in mathematical models that look at the transport and fate of that air, water, and soil, and get a handle on where to focus our resources on both monitoring and trying to deal with this problem where we've contaminated our planet and its atmosphere with particulates containing every heavy metal and toxic organic chemical.
To be clear on what we see up in the sky with the contrails, there are many people who believe that these are applications of deliberately toxic chemicals that are sprayed into the atmosphere, whereas I believe you're referring to just the rate of nucleation from the ice particles and precipitating these toxic elements out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that ongoing battle, and I've read up on it and just don't have enough information to form an opinion beyond the fact that I believe somebody really needs to look at what's going on there. My natural tendency, I mean, it's like I've got 2 brains. My natural tendency based on my background as a research microbiologist and as an analytical chemist worked for Steve Agagi for a while at their operation in McIntosh, Alabama. As a chemist, those backgrounds tend to drive me towards having almost an aversion to conspiracy theories, I guess, for a general term. But I have also lived a second life since that bears no resemblance to my previous life. Once I was contacted by Donald Trump's Executive Transition Committee and asked whether I would accept the position of science advisor if it were offered, which I said I would, feeling like under any administration I could do better than what a lot of people have done in the past in that kind of a job. But at that little window of time, and this is before any hint of this showed up in the media, of strange things going on in 2017. But I suddenly had scientists, a handful of them, 6 of them, I think all told, individuals descended on me from China, Latvia, primarily former Soviet bloc countries, um, and offering me um, research funding, whatever I wanted, in terms of a place to do my research and funding to do whatever I wanted to do. But in a large component of that, there were individuals, first females and then males, making sexual, well, I would call it, there is no word for it in sexual assault, but making sexual advances at me, toward me, touching me. There's to live to be in my 70s, never having experienced anything like that in all of my career, and suddenly have an onslaught of it that came within weeks of being approached by the Trump administration. It was just too much of a coincidence. But to be honest with you, I don't know which side of this coin is going to do us in first. Is it the Trump side, where you've got clearly aggressive foreign intervention from Russia and elsewhere in our government affairs at every level? Is that the worst case scenario? Or is it going to be China offering me a place on what they described as the equivalent of the, your dream resort in the world, a trip to the Mediterranean, live there and do your research, and you'll have all the laboratories, all the money, all the entertainment you want. I don't know whether China or Russia or Latvia or other Balkan countries offer more threat than one of the others. It's out of my pay grade and field of work, but it's enough to make me wonder what lies ahead.
The world has really gone crazy, but like you, I tend to lean towards a natural explanation for things if one is available, where conspiracy theories, that's kind of a last resort for me.
Me too, yeah, and it should be for everyone.
So a question, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, and some really unusual neuroinflammatory illnesses emerged right at the end of the Civil War. Da Costa syndrome, soldier's heart, effort syndrome, or otherwise called neurasthenia. Do you connect your paradigm with neurasthenia?
I don't, I'm not familiar with that disorder. If it's connected in any way with the functioning of any organ of the body, from the brain down, then it is impacted in a big way by this issue, land application of treated sewage sludge.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about my background.
If I could elaborate, if I could add one thing, I remember back, I often go back in my own memory to the day that I was asked to visit the endoscopy clinic at the University of Miami, because they were seeing lots of teenagers with cancer, colon cancer, and they'd never seen this before. And I don't know what all causes or might be behind that. But what immediately comes to my mind is if we're ingesting all of these particulates loaded with high concentrations of every carcinogen, known and unknown, all it takes to get colon cancer is just for one microscopic sludge particle to get lodged by whatever twist or mechanism is involved, lodge in the colon, and I've seen endoscopy of the colon done, colonoscopy, real time. So there's lots of places for a trillion of these particles get stuck in the colon for a while at that microscopic level. All it takes is one of them to cause one colon cell to revert to the cancerous state, metastasize, and you've got colon cancer. So I don't know how a problem gets any bigger than this. And just about every disease we're dealing with, they cross the blood-brain barrier. We found the scariest photomicrograph I have ever seen in my life as a scientist was photomicrograph of an ape's brain, a thin section of the ape's brain, and using animals for experimental work is a world I don't even like to think about, much less apes. But so I was shown this photomicrograph, and what it showed was the ape's brain after the ape had been injected with vaccines that contain the aluminum adjuvant. And the aluminum adjuvant crosses the blood-brain barrier. So in the photomicrograph of the brain, it looked like looking up at the stars on a clear night. All these vacuoles, empty space surrounding these little aluminum particles, zillions of them. And I can't get that out of my brain. I had a long conversation more than once with my own primary care physician about where I drew the line in me receiving vaccines is I said, I'll take the vaccines, but I'm not going to take any vaccines with aluminum adjuvants in it, period. And I showed him the study that I was talking about, and he shook his head and he said, you know, I don't even know how that phenomenon, that is having your brain shot full of microscopic holes, how that would manifest as a disease. And I said, you know, I don't have a clue either, but it can't be good.
Yeah, my experience is that I got sick as part of a very famous cluster of illness, which wind up being studied by the Center for Disease Control and turned into a syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome. There were about 160 of us at North Lake Tahoe in 1985, and we all got ill with a strange flu-like illness that nobody could understand. And the Center for Disease Control came out and encountered a problem where certain clusters of neurological, neuroinflammatory illness were occurring in sick buildings. All the clusters were in sick buildings. And I was adamant that we ought to look in these sick buildings to find the cause. But at the time, the Center for Disease Control and all the researchers were so fixated on viruses that this is all they were going to look at. And they abandoned the sick building investigation and spent the next 35 years chasing viruses. And I continued looking into the buildings. And that's the subject of this poster behind me, which talks about how chronic trichothecene exposure may be indistinguishable from chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, not really indistinguishable, because it was the toxic mold in these buildings that was actually a driving force in our problem. And by way of crude experimentation, I took people to the sick buildings to observe their reactions, and everybody with the chronic fatigue syndrome diagnosis was having an extremely adverse, I mean, insanely bad reaction, even getting close to these buildings. And one of the people that I took interest in was from Reno, who had come up and got a diagnosis during this period, who was a crop duster pilot. So he was blaming organophosphate pesticides, the materials he worked with, even though he was the only one to really have this problem. But he had the most peculiar complaint, which was every time the wind blew from the settling ponds, the sewage settling treatment plant, in his direction, he would become violently ill, extremely ill. Microscopic amounts, just the smallest amounts of something from the sewage treatment plant. So since I was curious about this, I went down and deliberately got near the sewage treatment plant, experienced the reaction for myself, sent other people down there. They had a similar reaction. And then conversely, I started taking these people up to the very same sick buildings, and we could reproduce the symptomology from these sick buildings.
Yeah, it is a subject that has caught my attention as well, particularly recently, just a couple of months ago. A filmmaker in California came out here to do an interview of me for a video she wanted to put together about my research. And she was telling me about how she got interested in my research. She found that when she bought a new house in California, that she started experiencing symptoms of that reminded me of sick building syndrome, migraine headaches, difficulty breathing. So I brought that up to her and asked her, we discussed it further and got onto the topic of the fact that she had discovered the source of the smell coming out of her basement that was triggering these reactions. And what it was, she said that when she would crawl in a crawl space, the symptoms would just overwhelm her. And she started looking at the history of the property and found out that her house was built on an old land application of sewage sludge site. And California is full of land that way, particularly from the source being Los Angeles. But that was interesting to me, that connection she made. But because in my own mind, I really never thought about that. What about all of these people that are moving into work in some building that's built on land that maybe the records don't even exist from 20 years ago that show that that land has been covered with treated sewage sludge. And all the buildings we work in have been built that way. I have experienced personally those same reactions. For example, when I was being interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times, and we were sitting in an agricultural area of Georgia after dark, after she'd done all her filming, and in the area where the hay was fertilized with land-applied sewage sludge, and a lot of that hay was baled up on bales, and we sat down on a couple of bales that were beside the highway, sort of wrapping things up and talking about the day. And no longer than we'd sat on those bales for a couple of minutes, I started getting migraine headaches. I was getting shortness of breath. I was getting visual problems. And I realized all of a sudden, she did too, that we were experiencing the same thing that the people living around the farms were experiencing and tying to land application sewage sludge. But I was also tying it to a couple of buildings that I investigated, one of them being a federal building that I investigated at the request of the federal government, where residents were complaining of what anyone would describe as sick building syndrome. And as I went in and went into the basement areas and whatever, and looking through the venting system, and I could see black molds growing on them, you know, and it struck a cue with me because of an interesting experiment that I did with sewage sludge. I was trying to isolate different bacteria and algae and fungi that I could experiment with individually to look at their metabolic pathways and whatever. And I decided one day to just separate the fungi from the bacteria and see which one was playing the biggest role in biodegradation. It was an easy thing to do because based on my medical training, I was familiar with amphotericin B and other polyene antibiotics that are used for fungal infections. And they're very effective. I mean, within seconds, they shut down fungal metabolism. So what I did with my sludge samples was to add amphotericin B, and I repeated the experiments with nystatin, a different polyene antibiotic, and got the same results. What it showed was that the overwhelming majority of the biological activity going on in sewage sludge applied to fields was fungal. It was molds. And so that connection, I couldn't help it. This is the same thing I was experiencing personally when the New York Times reporter and I were sitting on these hay bales that were contaminated with sludge, visible amount, and I was visiting these federal buildings and commercial buildings, looking at the health records of the employees working there. It was the same script.
I have to ask, are you familiar, have you ever heard of the history of Stachybotrys, the discovery of the toxic black mold?
Yeah, I am, and I started to bring that up or mention it myself recently, and I thought, gosh, it's been decades since I've looked at that literature. I better just keep my mouth shut.
So,
But Stachybotrys is a major problem associated with land application of sewage sludge.
and it was on hay that Stachybotrys was first discovered when Stalin's cavalry horses were being poisoned. And
Yeah.
he ordered that his veterinarians find out the cause of the sickness in his horses. Otherwise, they were going to face a firing squad. And that motivated them a little bit. And they discovered this trichothecene producing toxic black mold. And this narrowed it down. So it's highly likely that when you were sitting on the hay, that hay was probably infested with Fusarium or Stachybotrys.
Yes, in fact, there were, as I looked at those hay bales, and I've looked at hay bales in other areas as well, I've wondered and never actually taken my microscope out and looked at it. But in every case, you can see what appears to be indistinguishable, which is this very black particulates coming from sewage sludge and Stachybotrys growing in bales of hay or hay that's been spread out on the land and got rained on. So we may be well talking about exactly the same thing. Unfortunately, both areas are under assault by all the mechanisms that are, I think, created by mainly, if not solely, by industries with vested interests to just dismiss these areas of research as fake science or whatever, not looked at as legitimate science. In my area, let me say this. It's an important point that I've learned throughout this whole journey of mine is that common sense so seldom weighs in with the science, and that's not right. My best example use of that is a scientist I met, a young scientist in Egypt, and I was invited there along with two other federal scientists from the United States to look at some problems there, which I won't get into, which are irrelevant really to this discussion. But in the course of going into this lab in Egypt and listening to one of their scientists talk about the problem, I looked at the scientist's incubator where he was incubating some microbiological cultures, and I said, your incubator is not working. And he pointed at the thermometer coming out the top, an expensive laboratory Celsius/Fahrenheit thermometer that cost a lot of money, and every scientist uses them at one time or another. Sticking out there, and I'm looking at the mercury level, and I said, your thermometer's broken. And he looked at me like I was just, he had me repeat it. I said, your thermometer's broken. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, and I won't mention his name, I keep trying not to do that. I said his name and I said, put your hand inside this incubator and tell me what it feels like. And he said that it was warm. And I said, do you have a fever? And he said, no. And so I said, well, then your thermometer is broken because it's reading, 10 degrees above a normal human temperature. And if it feels cool to you like it does to me, I said, your thermometer can't possibly be right. And he wanted to argue and argue. And I said, look, if you got another thermometer in this laboratory somewhere, and he said, yeah. And I said, go get it. And he brought it in, he put it in later, and it read the accurate temperature. And he was convinced. What disturbed me, and I run across it among scientists so much that it drives me crazy from time to time, is that common sense doesn't factor in. It should be common sense that you can't take every carcinogen, every mutagen, every toxic heavy metal, organic chemical in existence, mix it together in high concentration, spread it everywhere in land, water, and air, and it's okay because your science that you did in your laboratory indicates it's okay. And I'm at a loss when it comes to that. But time and time again, and it applies to moldy buildings.
Well,
I go in the buildings.
With your interest in moldy
and
buildings,
I
you must have
see,
followed the debacle with Ruth Etzel.
yeah, right. She was treated in the same manner that I was. I mean, it boils down to publishing data that scientists agree with the data. I mean, they can't point to anything you did wrong. The data can be replicated, but they're going to argue some government policy that's pushed by politicians and very qualified scientists that have been elevated to the tops of these agencies and are going to defend the agencies rather than lose their jobs. That's the system we're in.
Do you think that when Ruth Etzel testifies in front of, the heads of high-level EPA officials, do you think anything will come of it?
No, I don't. I don't, because there were multiple congressional hearings held on my research that were supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. And the Republicans used it to just say, well, you can't trust EPA science. And to a certain extent, that's right, because EPA's best scientists evacuated EPA when what happened to me, when it was apparent that the only scientists that would remain employed there would be scientists who fell in step with the policies, government policies, which at that time was Bill Clinton's policies. And at my level, I don't know how you fix the problem other than what I mentioned at the beginning. You have to get a president on your side to do like FDR did in times of war. You have a problem where you've got Republicans who would love to have any scientist testify about anything if it indicates science has got that EPA has got science problems, you know. You can't trust their science. That's just the political world they live in. It's not going to change. You can't expect them to do anything differently. If they did something differently, they would be not reelected, and they'd be replaced by somebody who would lie about whatever.
Yeah, here at Exposing Mold, we're basically
What
pulling
I think,
off the entire medical profession having a bit of a science problem.
yeah,
Now, I use Stachybotrys as a symbol of what's gone wrong with the medical system, with the entire research profession, because when the Center for Disease Control was called to investigate the sick buildings, nothing prevented them from going in and looking at what we were pointing at. We asked specifically for them
yeah,
to look into the mold, and they refused. And all chronic fatigue syndrome researchers ever since have followed their lead in refusing to follow up on this evidence. Now, after they gave up and disappeared, the schools, the buildings, they conducted their own investigation, identified the specific toxic substance in proximity with the sick teachers, the sick employees, and they fixed it. They remediated it. They hired the best experts to come in, work out a remediation protocol, remove the toxic mold, and restore the buildings to normal function. So to solve this
yeah.
incredible mystery, the chronic fatigue syndrome, could have been done in probably a few hours if they had followed up.
Yeah.
Dr. Lewis, we cannot hear you at all if you're talking.
You're in luck. I'm not talking.
Oh, fantastic.
That's easier to solve. I was just digesting what we were just talking about and thinking about Joe Biden. Getting back to COVID, which we're all grappling with, the whole world is grappling with right now. It boils down to a simple issue as well, at least in my part of that world of research, that here we are making COVID vaccines, Pfizer and others, and I have been vaccinated, even though there are a whole lot of things I would change in the way vaccines are made and marketed. Still, it was my decision to do that, and I let my wife make her own decision, of course. And yet, here we are moving toward a point in time where already another company has submitted to the FDA and the CDC their vaccine for COVID-19, which they want approved. And it is a live attenuated COVID virus vaccine. So what that's going to do is end up generating sporadic cases of COVID in sewage sludge. And here again, we'll end up same places. It's going to be Afghanistan, Pakistan, parts of Africa are still going to be dealing with COVID 20 years from now, where the rest of the world getting killed vaccines whether it was the vaccines or something else, doesn't matter. The rest of the world is going to be not dealing with this issue, but it's going to be poor Afghanistan, poor Pakistan, where their people are dying left and right. The CDC's tallying the numbers and publishing them every year. You can look them up on the internet. Count the people dying. Afghanistan looks at the United States as a country that is set out to destroy them. And they use that as an example. And I'm sure they believe that. I would believe it if I lived in Pakistan. You've got to be killing me on purpose to do this. And yet, everything rocks along from one extreme to the other. Donald Trump, to Joe Biden, completely different ends of the spectrum. And here we have the same problem. Neither one of them can fix it or will fix it. Truth is, any one of them could get the person at their lowest level of their administration who has any microbiology at all to fix that problem. But it's not going to happen because of politics and money. When Nature covered my research in a news article, news editorial, that is, a plain editorial, I'll get it right sooner or later. Nature several years ago wrote about my research on biosolids and included was an editorial and a presentation of my research. And in that, the Nature called EPA's handling, actually the government's handling, the Department of Agriculture as well, as a failure of, I think it was 3 presidential administrations at the time, beginning with Bill Clinton, who came in, and even though his EPA administrator, Carol Browner, personally defended my work and gave me the Science Achievement Award for what the president wanted me out of work over. You know, that's the government we're dealing with. And I think the only hope is podcasts like this. It's getting the public educated on how our system works, where it fails, how bad it is. I was overjoyed when the videographer, the filmmaker in California, arrived and to interview me, and she was excited about my research on biosolids. And she began right off the bat by looking at me, and it wasn't on camera, I don't believe. She said, "This issue is more important than climate change." And she set out to be a scientist herself, and she was interested in marine science and climate change, has a strong science background, just like I have. But I took journalism at the University of Georgia, not just science, because I knew I needed to communicate whatever science I did to the rest of the world.
Wow. You are so full of gems, Dr. Lewis. I just want to go back to what you said earlier about how important the mold factor is. There's a current scientist out there named Dr. Richie Shoemaker, and he was looking into mold and had built his legacy upon it and was helping people overcome it, develop the CIRS diagnosis, chronic inflammatory syndrome. He's now switched gears to say bacteria is the main problem. making people sick. So by you saying that it's actually the opposite, that the fungus is much more of a problem, it's really reconfirming for us, because that's how we feel as well. But I wanted to switch gears a little bit here, and I wanted to ask you about Superfund sites. Now, are biosolids lumped into Superfund sites, or are those two separate contamination entities?
They are completely separated ideologically and at every other level as well. The wastewater industry and the federal EPA and USDA have worked very hard for decades at dismissing even the notion that there's anything heavy metal wise, toxic chemical wise, microbial wise in treated sewage sludge that presents any public health problem risk at all. So it's just a stone wall that can't be moved, except by the President of the United States.
Yeah. So just to confirm, when you go to the EPA's website and you look at their Superfund sites, it's not including biosolid sites.
Right.
Wow. That's quite shocking.
There probably are some Superfund sites that have received biosolids, but there is no site where biosolids has been dumped or placed, spread, that has ever been designated a Superfund site because somebody went in there and said, hey, this thing's sky high in lead levels, mercury levels, you name it. It's like having two brains, you know, in one head. They're not connected, and yet they're diametrically opposed.
Is that because it's been denied, as in you or someone else has expressed the desire to the EPA to make also a biosolids map and the EPA shut it down, or it's just something that has never even come up?
The whole issue is rested upon fighting the US EPA bureaucracy and Department of Agriculture at the highest levels to just allow any federal employee to remain employed and look at that problem. There are none. When I walked out the door at EPA, when I was terminated, I ran into the research director on the way out, and he was telling me, you know, wishing me the best and saying how sorry he was that what happened. And I just looked at him and said, I just hope you guys will continue this research. And he instantly said, no way, not after what happened to you. And that has happened across the agency, and it happened at the University of Georgia. I mean, I was kicked out of the graduate faculty there for publishing that research, and the reaction that the Dean of Agriculture got who's appointed by at the University of Georgia at the highest levels, he clearly stated that my research would not be tolerated there, and explained to the Department of Marine Sciences head, who happened to be my line of chain boss at the University of Georgia, head of the Department of Marine Sciences. The dean looked at him and said, when he explained that I had to go, we kicked off the graduate faculty, he said, the dean said, we're dependent on this money. Money from EPA, money from the wastewater industry. It's the same thing that Dwight Eisenhower said on his way out, that our ivory towers, that the universities once were, are no longer the fountain of truth. It's all dictated by money and politics. It's not about science anymore. Science is whatever you get published in the scientific literature and the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And I demonstrated that clearly at the University of Georgia when me and a couple of dairy farmers filed suit against the scientist at the University of Georgia who knowingly published fake data. And it went before a federal judge. And the judge wrote about a 20-page decision on it, which was unheard of, explaining how I was fired at EPA and the University of Georgia for simply publishing valid data. That had become all about politics. And none of that raised any option anywhere in government or academia that could deal with that outcome. That you end up at a brick wall and you can go no further or farther.
Well, what we're dealing with right now with the sick building syndrome phenomenon is that it's emerging so quickly and affecting so many people. And thanks to the internet, we can talk about this. We've all run into the problem that our research institutions and our federal agencies have completely failed us. They are refusing to address this. They won't even talk to us about it.
I know, and the question is what to do about it other than what we're doing now. I was invited to speak at Harvard University on this very subject, and the audience, the room was packed wall to wall with not just Harvard, but other surrounding universities. There's a lot of interest in hearing my story that someone this prominent in science can be fired by the federal government for no legitimate reason, just because their science doesn't match the government's policies. There's a huge amount of interest in it. I was invited to speak at the Royal Society of London about this. And like Harvard University and Boston University, where I also spoke on this, you get packed crowds of scientists and professors wall to wall, all interested in this. Even though the Royal Society of London took my presentation to Nature and said, what about this, and tried to bring attention to it, and Nature's covered it. Still nothing is done. And the flip side to this is even worse. When I was watching, participating in a scientific conference and happened during a break to catch something going on CNN, it turned out to be the whole Andrew Wakefield debacle about vaccines being a problem as far as transmitting infectious diseases that they were designed to cure, including rubella. And it just blew me away that this poor group in London of solid scientists, some of the best scientists in the UK, were getting dismissed because of questioning the veracity of this vaccine. As I listened to CNN News broadcast worldwide, is Anderson Cooper called Andrew Wakefield, who I knew nothing about, had never heard of, called him a liar that he published all this fake data in the Lancet. And I published multiple papers in the Lancet, and that caught my attention. The only difference between me and Anderson Cooper is, as far as I know, I jumped right on downloading the Lancet article and was blown away to read it and see it says exactly the opposite of what Anderson Cooper claimed was in the Lancet article and accused Andrew Wakefield of fabricating. And you would think that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. To this day, I've published it in my book, Science for Sale. I've given talks about it around the world, including to Harvard University and the Royal Society of London. And I say, look what was done here. But guess what? Just not more than a month or two ago, I turned on the TV and what's going on? There's Anderson Cooper back saying the same old lies again and still trying to make a big deal out of Andrew Wakefield, who, if you read his Lancet article, says there is no evidence to support the idea that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And in my own research, I've published in Lancet and elsewhere the fact that, we do have a problem with vaccines because rubella, you can make the attenuated form, and it is used in vaccines, and it goes into sewage sludge, and it reverts back to the live rubella vaccine, and rubella causes autism. Everybody agrees with that. You've got all these elements of solid science nobody ever even disagrees on. But thanks to mass media, more than anything, CNN News, the evening news by NBC, you name it, when you've corrupted that system to where what you turn on TV, every American turns on TV and sees, if you tried to explain to them that news anchor actually is lying, what he's claiming the scientific article says isn't what the scientific article says, you get nowhere. How do you fix this problem?
Absolutely, Dr. Lewis. We're coming up on about 2.5 hours here, and this has been the most solid 2.5 hours. in the history of exposing mold. This interview is just absolutely golden. And you've made it very, very crystal clear to everyone that we cannot trust these governmental agencies. We cannot trust our media because they've been so infiltrated with industry money, indoctrinated, and we are stuck in this perpetual ignorant cycle of lies, of loyalty to money, loyalty to power and position. And I just want to put this out there that you have made this problem the forefront for us. And we would love to help you continue on fighting, being a part of whatever you're working on, or let us know what we can do to support you so we can start working on this ourselves, because you've made it very, very crystal clear again that this is a major problem for the sake of humanity. And, you know, we're here trying to do the best we can to help. And again, we would love to partner with you to help you out to further, you know, your research, your mission. You know, we would love to be instrumental with that.
Well, that's the best news I've heard since I even ever got involved in any of this. That is really my wall. You know, I can deal with the science and take it that far, but getting someone on the other end that gets this information out to the general public effectively is all we need to actually fix these problems.
Yeah, I definitely feel like raising awareness is important, but I definitely think we need to step the gas here. We need to go 100 miles an hour at this, as we don't really know how much more time left we have with all of the contamination and everything that we keep emitting and everything else. We can at least help with dealing maybe with the biosolids, you know, maybe providing some sort of education. We do have a plan to launch a symposium next year, and we'd love to have you as a guest speaker to address this, along with other very honest, highly decorated doctors and scientists, because we are building a team of people like you who are addressing these problems head on, and not just following the money paper trail.
Oh. And one thing that we can do together is to promote really good film documentaries like the one that will be coming out. Of course, I wouldn't advise anybody to recommend anything sight unseen, no matter who does it. But I'm very excited and hopeful about the documentary that's currently being put together by a group of German and Swiss producers that came over and spent time interviewing me and working with others on this issue. They're shooting for November, is coming out with a movie that will be widely distributed worldwide, that I'm trying to get them to change the title of it, at least in the United States. It's called Holy Shit, Can Poop Save the World? And I've got the producers, the filmmakers, to agree to at least edge it over to Holy Crap for the American audience. And they have agreed that they will do that.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to hook us up with them, you know, any way, shape, or form that we can promote this work and this message, again, is extremely important for the livelihood of humanity. And you also have a book, right? Science for Sale, How the U.S. Government Uses Powerful Corporations and Leading Universities to Support Government Policies, Silence Top Scientists, jeopardize our health, and protect corporate profits. I will link your book below for our audience to purchase. And you also made mention that you are coming out with another book. Could you please share more about that?
Yes, the second book is totally unlike my first book, and it deals with my firsthand experiences that I alluded to earlier, where I was approached by the Trump Executive Transition Committee, and then all kinds of things happened to me involving foreign agents. It's preceded by something that happened to me when I was a teenager, 19 years old. I was abducted, and I was able to escape in the dark of the night, and it was a nerve-wracking experience, but it sort of opens the door to the kind of characters that I encountered in the early days of the Trump administration who were coming after me. So I think it makes an interesting story, and I can tell in a factual way with my own experience how big of a crisis we're in globally, and make the point that these issues, like how the government handles sick building syndrome, how the government handles land application of sewage sludge, this corruption of science and the firing and running off of scientists at the CDC, the FDA, the EPA in mass, that the world's got to understand what happened to science and realize that this combo of journalism and science we got going now, you really are going to have to pull up your sleeves, go to the scientific articles, read them, and see if they even say what CNN News claims they say. Because I got news for you. It may not. It may say exactly the opposite. And it's going to be the average person's fault if our democracy falls, because that's what it's going to take. It's the average, everyday Joe and Mary that's out there to learn what's going on and get involved and telling their congressmen and senators they know what's going on and they don't like it, and show up at the polls.
Thank you for
So
reaffirming.
that wraps it up for me.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lewis, for reaffirming that. We've had other doctors on, and people who are dedicated to digging into that research, demanding the same thing. We have to be active by our votes. We have to be vocal with our local representatives, and we have to start there. I 100% agree with you. Thank you again, Dr. Lewis, for coming on today. We will link your current book that you do have out below. We will stay posted on what you have coming out in the future. It sounds very, very interesting. And yeah, we would love to promote also Holy Crap, the upcoming documentary, which you're featured in. That was a great title. But I'm just going to record our closing now. Was there anything else that you wanted to say, or anyone else have any questions before we let Dr. Lewis go for the day?
I'm done.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We had Dr. David Lewis on. He was a microbiologist with the EPA. He's won the highest award in the EPA, and some shady stuff went down with him. And he was so forthright with us with everything that he has learned, the vast amounts of research and knowledge that he carries is still extremely valid today. And we cannot wait to help Dr. Lewis to hopefully resolve, if not, make waves, let people understand what's going on with our sewage and how toxic it can become and how toxic it is. So thank you again for tuning in today. Please like, share, comment on our content. Also, subscribe to our podcast on all podcasting channels. You can find us there. Please also rate us. We love to see all the wonderful reviews from our audience. And check out our GoFundMe and Patreon pages to keep this podcast rolling. Thank you all again, and we'll see you next time.